you in a moment. In the meantime, for more on today's announcement, let's bring in Danielle McLaughlin, a litigation attorney in Nixon Peabody's New York City office, has written extensively on the Supreme Court nominating process. Danielle, thanks so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
So, native of Lincolnwood, Illinois, Harvard grad, clerked for Brennan, was considered a contender when Justice Stevens stepped down. What should we know about Judge Garland?
So Judge Garland, I would say, is a consensus candidate, as folks have been saying in the last 30 minutes or so. He's known as a moderate, as he's been on the D.C. circuit for 13 years, and so there's a lot of jurisprudence for us to take a look at. A couple of things really stand out. Number one is that he was one of the authors of an opinion that said that Guantanamo detainees could not have civil trials, which was subsequently reversed by the Supreme Court. And the second thing to know is that in all of his years on the D.C. circuit, only 8 times did he overturn an appeal of a criminal defendant. So I think what we're going to see is progressives. He won't be progressive enough for those, and for some conservatives, Republicans, he's not going to be conservative enough for them.
But Danielle, one thing that strikes me about Merrick Garland is the area that conservatives point to on him and ding him on is gun control, that he seemed to be in favor of the D.C. handgun ban that was struck down by another court. In this kind of a political environment, the Republican base that's already said in polls it feels betrayed, and that's leading their voting, could the Senate even seem to be open to a character like that, with that kind of voting record, even if he's being touted as a moderate, given that the Second Amendment has come up again and again this political season?
Certainly, the Second Amendment looms large here. It always does in every political cycle, and the opinion that you're talking about is, of course, Washington, D.C. versus Heller. And Antonin Scalia authored the opinion in the Supreme Court, which struck down most of the handgun ban in D.C. So certainly, I think that there will be some issues. Obama was never going to nominate someone that Republicans were going to be completely happy with, and frankly, that's not his job. I think on balance, though, he is a moderate candidate. I can see him in the vein of Kennedy, someone who goes some ways and on some issues, in some ways in others. Certainly a principled jurist. I don't think anyone has any arguments with that. So there will be discussion, there will be debate. I think there's going to be still problems, certainly as we go down into the midterms, if there is obstructionism for someone who's really a very, very qualified candidate.
We've seen, obviously, as people start digging through his decisions of the past, people point to his rulings as it results to criminal justice. Do those tend to lead liberal, moderate, or conservative in your view?
Conservative, as I indicated earlier. There have only been, I think, 8 instances in 13 years, which is a very long time on the D.C. circuit, or frankly on any federal court, in which he has overturned the criminal appeal, or basically allowed a criminal appeal to go back down on remand to a federal district court. So he's conservative on criminal justice.
Danielle, we're joined once again by Danielle McLaughlin, who joins us having written a lot about the nominating process, litigation attorney in Nixon Peabody's New York City office. Danielle, the president talks about this tit for tat, but already some go back to his own history as Alito was up for confirmation. Isn't that already in process?
Well, there was a difference with Alito, to be clear about Obama and his position on Alito. What Obama objected to with respect to Alito's background was the role that he had in authoring torture memos for George W. Bush. So there was a reason. It wasn't a blanket filibuster. He said that he had a problem not only with his own personal philosophies, but he felt that some of the things that Alito had written were not really in line with his vision of America. And so I think there's a little bit of a difference there. You know, I think there were 3 really. It was interesting to me that speech that Obama gave was sort of set up into 3 thirds. We had the background piece, we had the judicial piece, and then really a full third of his speech was dedicated to discussing, or his talking points really, on asking the Senate to be fair and even to consider the nomination of the justice.
Danielle, what is the precedent for refusing to consider this sort of nomination, whether it's outright declaring ahead of time we're not going to consider the president's nominee for the Supreme Court, or delaying it as long as possible? I mean, aside from the filibuster, has there been a case close to this environment that you can think of?
I mean, we can look back to the confirmation hearings of Robert Bork, which was, many years ago now. But of course, at least Robert Bork, who was a very strong Conservative, got hearings. I don't think we've ever seen a Senate come forward, or certainly not a letter put forth by the Senate Judiciary Committee, that have said we will not consider a nominee no matter who it is. And what we see from Obama is just asking for a simple fairness. He spoke about the Supreme Court and its role in our tripartite republic as being above politics. And that's certainly the case if you look at the structure of the institution. Supreme Court justices aren't elected. Supreme Court justices, like all other federal judges, have a lifetime appointment. They wear black robes. They're meant to be above the fray.
And Danielle, that turned into a whole term, getting borked. I mean, are we in that same category now based on what the Senate does or doesn't do with Merrick Garland?
It's hard to say. I mean, getting balked would actually require hearings, and we're not even there yet. We've had complete obstructionism from senators, from Republican senators. So I guess it remains to be seen. I will say there's a big difference between Robert Bork and Judge Garland, and Robert Bork was fairly far to the right, and that was sort of the issue with Democrats during those hearings. From what we can tell, and of course there are many people scouring his opinions, 19 years is a long, long time, to see whether he is as dangerously progressive as some on the right will have people say. It's not clear to me that he is. One thing that is clear is that he speaks very genuinely about fidelity to the Constitution, which is very important no matter what political stripe you are. And certainly his lifetime of political service, being a justice, is really one of the ultimate ways that you can serve this republic.
We're expecting to hear from Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell in a moment on this very issue, but already some statements coming out from some congressmen and senators who argue that the American people deserve to have a say in this nomination.
Yes.
What does someone with the constitutional law background say about that?
Well, I would say that the American people have already had their say. President Obama was elected the second time for a 4-year term and not a 3-year term. And certainly the notion of a lame duck presidency it's a term that is bounced around and used regardless of whether you have a Republican or Democrat in the White House. But ultimately, it's an 8-year, it's two 4-year terms. He's still the president. And so the notion that the American people are better served or should be served by the next president appointing a Supreme Court nominee makes no sense and has no basis in the Constitution.
Danielle, we appreciate your guidance today. Obviously, big news, and we're in for a long process here, arguably. Danielle McLaughlin is a litigation attorney at Nixon Peabody's New York City office.